Hi, I'm Josh. I'm from Xbox Live. And this is Josh from Xbox Live. And today I have a question for you.
Where was Gondor when the Westfold fell?
If you answered that Gondor was defending the passes of Anduin the Great at Carandros and Osgiliath when the Westfold fell, then you are correct. If you're anything like me, then you've probably seen Peter Jackson's The Hobbit trilogy once, and Peter Jackson's The Lord of the Rings trilogy 1 billion times. If you're anything like me, then you really do want to enjoy all these new fantasy series and films that are coming out right now in the 2020s, in an era that by all accounts should be the golden age of fantasy.
I'm nobody.
You are Elora Danan, and the world's last, best hope against the evil coming to destroy us all.
What?
But it isn't. If you're anything like me, then you find yourself coming back again and again to the classics like The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars, and maybe a handful of other transcendent works of fantasy. If you're anything like me, then you've been wondering for a while now, what exactly is that itch, that Star Wars and Lord of the Rings scratch, that our contemporary 2020s fantasy doesn't scratch?
Thank you.
In an effort to answer this question, I'd like to introduce a new concept. It's something I call elevated fantasy. And I'd like to define this term one word at a time, beginning with, what is elevated? So most of us have heard of the term elevated horror, and we can recognize it when we see it. But describing this term is a little trickier than it seems. The first question asked is, elevated as opposed to what? And the answer is really simple. It's as opposed to the B film, the genre film, the low art film. We might actually struggle to understand this concept now in our deeply postmodernized pop culture, where we don't really have a clear distinction between high art and low art.
And the Oscar goes to Everything, Everywhere, All at Once.
But the term elevated is in keeping with that altitudinal metaphor. This altitudinal metaphor also comes with a connotation of judgment, as does the term B-film, as if it's a grade in school, and the higher the grade, the better. So the reason that I'm skeptical of the concept of elevated films right off the bat is that they don't really respect the B-film.
It creates, passive viewers to have these genres that are where these films are pumped out, one after the other, and they're just kind of meeting the demands.
They think B-films must be elevated in order to have value.
I want to show that beneath the Technicolor sheen of the 1950s, things were just as rotten as they are today. A B-movie with A ideas.
Now, the reason why this quote from Maxine infuriates me so much is because B-films do have A ideas. Take a look at the original Night of the Living Dead from 1968. This film has long been read as an expression of racial and class tensions in America, coming as it did on the heels of the civil rights movement.
Elvis Mitchell has been working on this thing of the top 10 seminal, basically black movies, for lack of a better term, starting in the late 60s. Number one is Night of the Living Dead.
Just 1 year before, 1967, there was an A film called Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, which explored some of the very same ideas, albeit in a more tasteful, dramatic, and explicit manner.
As for you two and the problems you're going to have, they seem almost unimaginable. But you'll have no problem with me.
The B film is the place where you explore the same ideas in a less explicit way, in an oblique, indirect, or symbolic manner. So just for reference, let's just pick a random year and look at 1963, a year where we saw the film Jason and the Argonauts. Okay, it's fun. It's stupid. It's a B film. But we also had a film called Winter Light. It's smart, but a little dull. A film. Both of these films are about man's fraught relationship with the gods, the beings in the sky. But they have wildly different approaches, and they appeal to wildly different audiences. But there was a third film from 1963 about beings in the sky, a film called The Birds. Where does the birds go? Looking back today, we might want to classify it as an A film, since it's presented in such a classy manner. It's a Hitchcock film and has been discussed as one of the great films of film history for so long. But on paper, it's a horror film, a genre film. It was aimed at a mass audience. So in a sense, Hitchcock was the first person to elevate the horror film. 42 years later, Christopher Nolan would Batman begin a new trend of elevating superhero films. But it's not just horror films and superhero films that are being elevated. It's every genre. I mean, just look at the old James Bond films and compare them to the new ones that are coming out.
Felix. Felix.
In the 2020s, everything is being elevated. But how exactly does someone do that? But like, what is the thing that makes something elevated? Is it the fact that it's gritty? That it's realist? Is it the fact that it's somber? That it's serious? Elevated genre films are often all of these things, but I don't think that the essence of elevation lies in any of those four adjectives. For example, I would still consider something like Nimona to be elevated, even though it's neither gritty, realist, somber, or serious. In my opinion, elevation is essentially a psychological conceit.
Is something on your mind, Ambrosius?
Elevation adds depth,
I'm the monster.
gravitas, and realism to the inner psychological domain of its characters. To elevate something is to refuse to allow its characters to remain one-dimensional or archetypal ciphers, while you allow the plots to be genre plots, which is to say, one-dimensional. Characters will often have backstory that's told through flashbacks, they will often have internal conflict, and they are generally presented with an emotional naturalism that is meant to elicit an emotional response in the audience. This is serious, high drama.
You understand me?
The great horror films of the past, like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, do not waste 1 second of your time developing these characters beyond a few very simple traits. The characters are conceived as vehicles for the plot and little else. Today we consider that bad writing, and writers will fashion entire plot lines that revolve around exploring the wounds that these characters have suffered in their childhood, their trauma.
Trauma.
But the crucial thing to keep in mind here is that psychology as such is a very recent invention. Now, that's not to say that people before Freud didn't have minds. It's just to say that they conceived of a mind in completely different terms. So what we consider today to be emotional naturalism is entirely historically determined, which is to say, ideologically determined. For example, the romantic idea of melancholia is vastly different than our 21st century medicalized concept of depression, which is, again, totally different than the way medieval man conceived of sadness. And herein lies the inherent problem of elevating fantasy. It's a contradiction in terms. So, let's move on to the second term. What is fantasy? Fantasy is unique among all literary genres for taking place in what Tolkien called secondary worlds. Although, thankfully, not all fantasy stories take place in secondary worlds that are based on medieval Europe. They are all based in worlds that have some kind of magic. To be considered fantasy, the work must transport the reader into an entirely different world or a hidden part of our world where magic is real.
Welcome, Harry, to Diagon Alley.
Although we can already see many characteristics of what we call fantasy in the very earliest piece of literature that survives, the Epic of Gilgamesh. What we call fantasy as a literary genre really evolved in the late 19th and early 20th century. I'm definitely not the first person ever to connect 18th century romanticism to the rise of the fantasy genre, but it's important to keep in mind that romanticism was a direct response to modernity. It was a response to urbanization, to industrialization, to secularization, rationalization. It was basically anti-modern. It's to the Romantics that we owe much of our imagery of knights on quests. However, the great innovation of early fantasy writers like Robert E. Howard, who wrote Conan the Barbarian, was to look even further back than that, to look to Iron and Bronze Age history and mythology.
Conan is the damnedest bastard there ever was.
In fact, most fantasy is every bit as mythological as it is historical.
The mythology is based on oral stories that are passed down from generation to generation before the printing presses. And, you know, the Greek mythologies of the Trojan horse and Achilles and things, they survived through the years. The great Norse sagas survived through the years. But England, when the Normans invaded, whatever stories had been nurtured were eradicated by that. And so England's mythology was like medieval stuff like Robin Hood and King Arthur. I mean, it didn't go any further back than that. So Tolkien thought he wanted to create a mythology for his country, for England.
About 10 years ago, I set out to write a children's film. I had an idea of doing a modern fairy tale. Stumbled across A Hero with a Thousand Faces. After reading more of Joe's books, I began to understand how I could do this. It was a great gift.
But just because Lord of the Rings and Star Wars are explicit attempts by their creators to create a neo-mythology for modern man, that doesn't mean that everything we call fantasy does the same. One thing to keep in mind here is that fantasy is largely a literary genre, and only secondarily a film and TV genre. Although that might be changing now, there are still way more fantasy novels than there are fantasy TV series. And the thing about the novel is that it has its origins in the rise of modernity. The novel and modernity go hand in hand. The advent of the novel coincided with a new concept of the individual and the placement of human subjectivity at the center of the universe, as opposed to the subjectivity of God. That's why novels are either written in first person, from inside the head of the protagonist of the story, or from some kind of close third person where it is a God's perspective, but for some reason they're mostly concerned with the inner life of a protagonist. Weird. It's also why novels tend to be about characters who don't feel they belong in their world, where there's some kind of gap between the character and the world they inhabit. For lack of a better word, this is the modern condition. This is modern consciousness. Thus, fantasy novels actually do contain their own internal contradiction. The medium of the novel nudges it towards the modern, but its mythological imagination brings it to an anti-modern place. This is also why I think that every work of fantasy can be plotted on a spectrum that runs from the contemporary on one end to the mythological on the other. The mythospectrum, let's call it. Elevated fantasy is what I call works that veer heavily towards the contemporary end of the mythospectrum. They emphasize the relatable inner lives of their heroes and also the sympathetic motivations of their villains. Now, the question to ask is what makes something less contemporary and more mythological? I can think of 4 different answers to this question. My first answer has to do with the world building. So let's remember that in fantasy, you don't actually have to have a pre-modern world. Star Wars I consider fantasy, even though that's a futuristic world. What's important here is not how historical that world is, but how magical, how mythological that world is. Answer 2 has to do with language. Now, most people who are confronting The Lord of the Rings, either the book or the films, for the first time, are probably a little bewildered by the archaic dialogue.
The walls of your bower closing in about you, a hutch to trammel some wild thing.
What?
But this is part of a deliberate attempt not only to evoke a pre-modern world, but a pre-modern consciousness. For example, in Tolkien, you would never say he laughed like a crazy person. You would say he laughed as one Fae.
Isn't the word maybe a modern word? Sick. Terrible, low-class, trashy word that people use now, sick.
You would never call someone sick to describe their mental state. You would say instead,
your words are poison.
Now, language is a really big and important part of the fantasy genre, but it's not crucial. Now, The Lord of the Rings might sound a little bit like Hamlet, but Star Wars sounds a lot like American Graffiti.
Hey, you're supposed to be the fastest thing in the valley, man, but that can't be your car. It must be your mama's car.
She's fast enough for you, old man.
Despite its princesses and queens and knights and wizards, the characters in Star Wars actually speak with a distinctly 20th century North American vernacular.
We're all fine here now, thank you. How are you?
For example, Han Solo calls Luke kid.
Great kid! Don't get cocky!
Whereas a novelist like Tolkien or Gene Wolfe would use the more historical term child. But at least, they never use a super contemporary term like okay.
Okay, Lloyd.
I mean, can you just imagine if a major work of fantasy used the term okay? That's a term that has its origins in the slogan used in the re-election campaign of the 8th president of the United States, Martin Van Buren, in the 19th century. How perfectly modern. There's no more modern term than okay. It's like the least fantastical thing I could...
Okay, they're stars.
Number 3. This one has to do with morality. And this one can be an extremely thorny question, because we moderns have an inherent distrust of simple, clean dichotomies between, say, good and evil. And for some strange reason, we seem to think that the gray in the middle is actually better than the good. Someone explain that to me.
Killing Renfrey is the lesser evil.
Evil is evil, strike 'em all.
Now, for the fantasy writer, this can be a real problem, because fantasy often has a feudal political milieu. And we have a really hard time accepting that anything in that world and of that world can actually be good, simply because feudalism is completely anti-democratic, right? But I really think that the fantasy writer needs to look much deeper than this. To help us look a little deeper, I'd like to quote from one of my all-time favorite fantasy novelists, Gene Wolfe. He wrote a beautiful essay on The Lord of the Rings, which opens with the following paragraph. There is one very real sense in which the Dark Ages were the brightest of times, and it is this, that they were times of defined and definite duties and freedoms. A king might rule badly, but everyone agreed as to what good rule was. Not only every earl and baron, but every carl and churl knew what an ideal king would say and do. In such a moral matrix, villains are actually not heroes of their own stories. They're simply villains. And everyone, including themselves, would know this. The farmer who abandons his farm to go become a highway bandit does not have any delusion that he's doing a good thing. Pirates did not think they were revolutionaries. The cruel king did not think he was saving the world. Evil was evil, and there was no modern neurotic self-deception about it. But the real reason why fantasy takes place in worlds where good and evil are so clearly defined is not historical. It's mythological. So the image of a king returning to his throne should not be interpreted as an endorsement of feudal monarchies. It should be read as a symbol of the world being put back into balance. It should be read as a dream. This is the fourth and most important way that a writer can make their work more mythological and less contemporary. Their work is not animated by the socio-political logic of modern discourse. It is animated by the symbolic logic of dreams. To help explain exactly what I mean by this, we can turn to the writer Julian Jaynes, who in his book, The Origin of Consciousness and the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind, makes an amazing discovery about the logic of classical mythology. Without getting into the weeds of his broader argument, Julian Jaynes makes an observation about Homer, specifically the Iliad, that the gods are actually stand-ins for the character's psychology. He points out that it's one god who makes Achilles promise not to go into battle, another god who urges him to go, and another then clothes him in a golden fire, reaching up to heaven and screams through his throat. In this cavalcade of different gods impelling Achilles to act in one way or another, we actually get a sense that Achilles doesn't have a will of his own, that he's an empty vessel for the will of the gods. It's as if the gods are internal states, thoughts, emotions that are externalized. In fact, Jane writes, the gods take the place of consciousness. I think it's pretty fascinating the way that he finds the internal logic of mythology in this externalizing logic. In mythology, our inner demons become outer demons. Our inner struggles become the battles between armies. The world itself manifests man's collective unconscious. The disparate parts of our own consciousness become the dramatis personae who go on this epic adventure. This, in my view, is the crux of what makes mythology mythological.
You have it in you to make it epic.
Being epic. No, it's externalizing the internal. Mythology is an upside-down world where the invisible becomes visible. Thus, you don't actually need characters who have really deep three-dimensional psychology, because the entire world is symbolically their psychology. So this is why I place something like Nimona on the contemporary extreme of the Mythospectrum, and I want to be extremely clear why I'm doing that. It's not because there's technology in the world building. It's not because there's gay characters. I mean, look at ancient Greece. I mean, you know, there's no shortage of gay stuff going on there. It does have something to do with the contemporary dialogue.
This one. This guy looks extremely punchable.
And the questionable sense of humor.
Your uncle's head fell on my grandma's butt!
But it's above all because of the modern psychology of the characters.
You think that I would do that? That's who I am?
I don't know. You're the one who told me not to trust anybody, to question everything.
It's the idea that the monster just needs to be seen.
I see you, Nimona. And you're not alone.
I mean, can you imagine saying this to Sauron? Or maybe the Emperor? It would be silly, because those are not real people. They are archetypes. In elevated fantasy, therefore, you can't actually have the return of the king without it seeming like an endorsement of feudal monarchies. You can't have a line like "Man of the West" without it sounding like white nationalism. Elevated fantasy is a contradiction in terms because it speaks to our contemporary political discourse while at the very same time transporting us to a world where such discourse would not exist.
We're living in a dictatorship.
And it's for this reason why there are so many works of elevated fantasy that are playing all these weird subtextual discursive games of critiquing and interrogating themselves and questioning their own right to exist. I mean, just one thing to ask yourself, is Nimona's world supposed to be aspirational? They're every bit as progressive as the 21st century Western world when it comes to matters of sexuality, but they're downright feudal when it comes to questions of class.
For the first time in history, our safety will be put in the hands of a commoner.
I don't feel safe. It's not what Glorth wanted.
I really hope the Queen knows what she's doing.
So, is this world supposed to be a dystopia or a utopia? Are we supposed to long to live there, or are we supposed to be critical of it? There is no answer to this question, because elevated fantasy has this internal contradiction in its own logic. It is questioning its own foundations. To prove what I mean, here's a quote from the showrunners, one of the two showrunners of The Rings of Power. Villains are motivated by things that in their own heads make them think they're the hero of their own story. And that can make for really compelling drama. And so orcs who have dimension, who have things they care about, benefits all the stories in our mind. And such quotes really cut to the heart of what makes elevated fantasy so inherently frustrating for me. These writers think they're adding the dimension of psychology, but they're actually subtracting the dimension of symbolism. The orcs no longer represent slavery, they are victims of slavery. They are no longer representations of the shadow of mankind, the cruelty that lies within every man. They are no longer a fragment of our psychology, but beings with their own psychology. Of course, this retroactively makes the heroes of the Lord of the Rings the agents of a genocide, but it also shows their deeply modern secular view of evil. We moderns don't really have respect for an evil that actually knows it's evil and wants to be evil. This is the distinction between the Emperor in Star Wars, who laughs with glee as he does his dastardly deeds, and Darth Vader, a man who is conflicted, who suffers as he does what he thinks is the right thing. Great fantasy knows this distinction between immortal evil and mortal evil. You could say the same about the good characters, but what's crucial here is the distinction between the mortal and the immortal characters, from someone who is relatable and contemporary to some degree, and someone who is an unknowable, alien, archetypal cipher. Now, we can draw a really clear line in the sand between the contemporary and the mythological by looking at one case study. So let's compare Clash of the Titans from 1981 with Clash of the Titans from 2010. Clash 1981 is mythological leaning. Its protagonist is Perseus, the bastard son of Zeus. It's fitting that the protagonist is a demigod, because he is one part relatable film protagonist and one part unknowable cipher. He happily receives the gifts from the gods, and he chases his destiny with a relative lack of psychological interiority or moral doubt. Clash 2010, on the other hand, is contemporary leaning. Its protagonist is also Perseus, but a more modern one. He is not driven by love or by his destiny, but rather by revenge against the murder of his adopted nuclear family. He rejects the gods in general, he rejects Zeus as his father, he rejects the gifts that he receives to help him on his quests, and he also curiously rejects this prop from the original Clash of the Titans, which is sort of like the film rejecting its own inheritance of the previous film. 2010 Perseus even refuses to pray to Zeus when, in theory, that prayer would save his life. Okay?
Pray to your damn father. No!
This is a Perseus who has been influenced by Edward Bernays and Sigmund Freud. This is a Perseus with daddy issues. The same can be said of the villains from Clash 2010, who are often not simply demons that must be destroyed, but rather are sort of misunderstood. This is especially true of the way the two films treat Medusa. To quote Antonio Sana's essay on the topic, rather than lingering on her monstrosity, Clash 2010 focuses on Medusa's unjust punishment. In other words, Clash 2010 gives Medusa a relatable, legible human subjectivity that the previous film did not. Sana attempts to categorize Clash 2010 along Thomas Leach's 4 types of remake, which are readaptations, which repudiate the earlier film and attempt to faithfully reproduce the original text. 2, homages, which value the original film and subordinate to it their own textual claims. 3, updates, which critically or ironically revise their literary source. And 4, true remakes, which attempt to annihilate the model they are honoring. Sana goes on to say, Clash 2010 is not an adjustment of the primary mythical source to contemporary times, because the temporal setting is still ancient Greece. Nevertheless, the film favors a different system of values, especially if we consider Perseus's vindictive motivation against Hades, or the character's irreverent attitude towards the Olympian gods. I find the way that Clash 2010 deals with religion and with the supernatural to be fascinating. In Clash 1981, the gods are cool observers who deal with their mortal counterparts with a kind of warm indifference, and receive veneration and obedience from the mortal world. Whereas in Clash 2010, the gods are tempestuous tyrants who are followed by credulous fools and who punish human rebellion with relish.
You are specks of dust beneath our fingernails.
It's hard for me to read this as anything but a suggestion that the gods are simply stand-ins for worldly authorities, and that our rejection of the gods is akin to some sort of political revolution. Although I may share those revolutionary politics, what's so disappointing about this is that it doesn't let the gods be gods, that this is essentially a secular vision of Olympus. It turns the gods into modern human beings who have legible and relatable motivations. So the next question I want to ask is, so what? So what am I here suggesting? That Clash 1981 is better than Clash 2010? That we should return to the more simplistic and less psychological characters of the 1970s and 80s? No. Neither of the Clash of the Titans films are particularly engrossing or moving. Everything must evolve. The solution to bad progress is not noble regress, but better progress. That's why I don't really hate elevated fantasy. I can't bring myself to hate it, but I am disappointed by it. And I do look forward to the rise of something else, something that I want to call Enlightened Fantasy. Aha! The word enlightened evokes very different meanings in the West and the East. I'm using this term deliberately for all of its bicameral associations. Now, in terms of the mythospectrum, Enlightened Fantasy might lean mythological, but like Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, it's essentially balanced, because it follows mortal characters. However, those mortal characters are always, in some way or another, reaching for the divine. The key to Enlightened Fantasy is that it reaches for the mythological, just as George Lucas and Tolkien reached for the mythological, although they had to express their ideas in modern dramatic forms that are legible to we modern audiences. Although The Lord of the Rings is the better example for the genre's iconography and its language,
I am the servant of the secret fire, wielder of the flame of Arnor. The dark fire will not avail you, flame of Udun!
Star Wars might actually be the better example of what enlightened storytelling looks like, and the reason for that is extremely simple. Star Wars is always about pilgrims on the path to enlightenment. Star Wars is about mortals becoming divine. Luke Skywalker remains the paradigmatic example of an enlightened fantasy protagonist. He's a character who climbs the mythospectrum over the course of the story, beginning as a very contemporary, relatable, emotional character, and ending as a stoic demigod, a cipher, who is most powerful at the moment that he cools his human, all too human passions, and wields the transcendent power of the gods, the power to create reality by speaking it into existence.
You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi, like my father before me.
He is our modern-day Perseus, one part man and one part god. Now, you might argue the same thing is true of Frodo Baggins or Harry Potter, but I would argue that the motivations of both Anakin and Luke are far more explicitly to become a Jedi.
I will be the most powerful Jedi ever.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
Although, crucially, the two of them have very different visions on what that means. Frodo does reach a kind of transcendence, in my opinion. However, he never intended to become a wizard. Because in Tolkien's world, wizards are immortal beings. Hobbits do not become Maiar in Tolkien, just as Muggles do not become wizards in Rowling, just as non-benders do not become the Avatar in The Last Airbender. In fact, in most fantasy, mortals do not become immortal. But in Star Wars, they do. It's possibly because George Lucas was more eclectic in his vision. The Jedi are both Franciscan monks and Shaolin monks, and romantic knights, and Japanese samurai, and Western gunslingers. Depending on your view, the Force is either the Christian Holy Spirit, the Vedic concept of prana, Polynesian concept of mana, the Taoist concept of chi, the Hermetic concept of magic. In truth, it's all of these things, and more, because the Force is a deliberate attempt to create something new and therefore universal, that people from all over the world can relate to and project their own ideas into. Therefore, Enlightened Fantasy need not, and probably should not, draw too heavily and too specifically from concrete, historical, real human traditions. They should rather invent their own chimerical systems, synthesizing broad influences to create bastard mixes in an effort to create something universal. A new mythology. Fantasy writers fixate, rightly in my opinion, on world building. But the reason for that is that each magic system expresses its author's vision of how humanity can improve itself. A magic system is an interpretation of the very real matrix within which humanity can find its own divinity. Now, I want to be clear. Protagonists of Enlightened Fantasy do not need to be students of a very specific school of magic, like the Jedi or the Aes Sedai or Hogwarts. But they must be reaching in some way or another for the divine, for greatness, for the impossible. Enlightened Fantasy, therefore, does not need to begin on the mythological end of the spectrum, but must, over the course of its story, reach for it. It must walk the road from the profane to the sacred. Now, the reason I'm rambling about this is because I don't want to simply coin terms for things that I want to critique. I want to coin terms for things that I want to see more of. I want to see the golden age of fantasy that we were promised. I want to see more stories of humanity striving for its apotheosis. Stories that explicitly assert the existence and the primacy of the good. Stories that pave the way for our evolution to the stars. I want to see more stories of noble warriors seeking to perfect their souls. Mystics who grapple with evil on planes of reality that most people can't see. I want to see stories of good people called to greatness. I want to see stories where the power of friendship defeats evil. It's not that complicated. The legendary Goodreads critic J.G. Kelly, in his 1-star review of Robert Jordan's The Eye of the World, says this: "It's just modern characters with modern psychology, swinging around magic swords in a Disneyland version of history." And ultimately everything I'm saying here about elevated fantasy is summed up in this one sentence. However, it is crucial to remember that all of our stories are created by modern minds. We do not have access to ancient subjectivity. The entire genre of fantasy only exists for us alienated modern subjects who are, let's face it, nostalgic for a world that never was. A world where God still spoke to mankind. A world where magic was a fact and where honor. So with that in mind, it's actually important to remember that The Lord of the Rings and Star Wars are not extreme on the mythological end of the spectrum. They're actually quite balanced. I believe their great success has been to synthesize the modern and the mythological, to place characters that feel like real people into unreal worlds. Worlds which are alive with animal, vegetable, oceanic, subterranean, and spiritual forces. Star Wars and Avatar: The Last Airbender, and arguably The Lord of the Rings, chart the voyage of a mortal to their apotheosis, towards a miraculous feat that redeems the whole world. And what's great about these three works in particular is that the final hurdle of each of them is not a show of strength. It has nothing to do with power. The final hurdle on the road to apotheosis is a moral quandary. It is a moral choice. So for all the fantasy writers out there, I urge you to find your own balance between the contemporary and the mythological. I urge you to be wary of making your characters cardboard cutouts on one extreme, but avoid making them modern subjects on the other extreme. Avoid turning your villains into a socio-political other, and don't feel the need to give them a deeply sympathetic backstory. Remember, your audience are not attracted to fantasy because they want to see characters that embody the same doubts that they experience in their daily life, but just the opposite, because fantasy shows them a world where such doubts, such inner struggles are transposed and projected onto a magical world. Give yourself permission to be basic. Go ahead and give your world kings and queens and wizards and knights. But above all, show us your own vision of magic. Show us what it means to evolve. Show us how that final hurdle on the road to becoming a god is not simply about amassing more power, but it's about making a choice to be good. And if you think mankind has gotten tired of that story, gotten tired of seeing these tropes again and again, gotten tired of seeing worlds where there's good and evil, then why the hell are you writing fantasy? If you like this video, please check out my podcast. It's called Haven't Seen It Pod. It is the greatest podcast in the world. I also have a Patreon where I post some bonus videos and bonus podcast episodes, including a 2-hour episode about The Last Jedi and the state of Star Wars. Your support means the world to me. Have a great day.